especially in mainstream media newsrooms. They're seen as inherently biased until they prove otherwise, an assumption that would not be acceptable about any other group of people or any other minority. Light overstatement to say that Muslims and Arabs, and tell me if this sounds familiar, are essentially seen as either oil suppliers or potential terrorists. Very little of the detail, the human density, the passion of Arab-Muslim life has entered the awareness of even these people whose profession it is to report the Arab world. What we have instead, and this last sentence could not have been more chilling reading it all these years later, what we have instead is a series of crude, essentialized caricatures of the Islamic world presented in such a way as to make that world vulnerable to military aggression. These words were published in the April 26, 1980 issue of The Nation magazine, 23 years before the Iraq War. When I was growing up, as these discussions and arguments and debates took place among scholars and journalists, what I heard and watched in the background was live news coverage. And I think it's similar to the way our children are growing up now, although now it's much more saturated. Whether it was the nightly news in 1987, which saw the beginning of the Palestinian Intifada or uprising, or CNN after it launched a few years later. You see, Palestinians live and breathe politics and media. But despite round-the-clock coverage of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which dominated television and print media, it didn't mean that it actually led to understanding of what the conflict was about. In fact, there was profound confusion and misconceptions. So even though now many more Americans don't support Israel as they did when I was growing up, so far fewer Americans support Israel, there continues to be so much confusion about what the conflict is actually about. So as recently as last year, a poll showed that nearly half of Americans, 49%, believe it's Palestinians who occupy Israeli land rather than the reverse. So it shows you that even though a story can be covered ad nauseum, it doesn't mean that people are actually understanding what it's about. So growing up for me, it was easy to see how the core issues of the conflict were being distorted from the reality of it, which is obviously one over land and occupation, to one that was increasingly described as an intractable fight motivated by religion and culture. So how many of us have heard people describe it as they've been fighting with each other since the Bible days? Even as a child, it was clear to me how critical media coverage is in shaping people's narratives and understandings of the world and of major historical events. One of these major events was the first Gulf War. CNN, then a brand new 24-hour cable news channel, had its moment during that war. When the US-led coalition force began bombing Iraq in January 1991, all eyes were on the channel, which was televising the war, reporting live from a hotel in Baghdad. It's hard to believe now, but this was a turning point in how people consumed war reporting. This was a heavily televised war, and CNN came to dominate the world's understanding of it. This is when the concept of military embeds began, meaning much of the reporting came from traveling with the US military and adopting and echoing their perspective. Not surprisingly, CNN's dependence on the US military for access and information resulted in a relatively large coalition of support for the war. The practice of embedding with the military has now become entrenched and routine in war reporting. In fact, journalists who don't embed are in the minority. People like the late journalist Anthony Shadid, who chronicled the Second Iraq War through the voices of Iraqi civilians. His crucial work gave readers rare insight into the lives of ordinary Iraqis who suffered through the war. And it's no mistake that this textured human reporting, what Edward Said referred to as the detail, the human density, the passion of Arab Muslim life, was done by an Arab American journalist. On the flip side, and what's far more common to hear, are journalists like a New York Times reporter who came to my graduate school class at Columbia Journalism School. She covered the Iraq War, and she said with no hint of irony or self-awareness that she focused her reporting on the trauma suffered by US troops because in her view, Iraqis were so used to suffering that it wasn't newsworthy when they experienced death. This attitude by a journalist whose reporting appeared on the front page of the most influential newspaper in the world is unfortunately not unique. And it makes clear why it's so important for the field of journalism to diversify in all aspects. But back to 1990. Because I could see the power of the media in shaping perspectives, and because I was nosy, liked to write, and didn't mind talking to complete strangers, at the age of 12, I decided to become a journalist. So fast forward 10 years later, I'm out of college and looking for a start in the field. It's a really difficult profession to pursue because the pay is low, the hours are long, and especially when the internet developed, newspapers had to close down and jobs were few and far between. As the Iraq War was kicking off in 2003, a lot of young, hungry reporters were heading over there to cover it. For a variety of reasons, that wasn't an option for me, so I took a job with a community newspaper in DC, covering such exciting topics as neighborhood meetings in which residents complained about graffiti on walls, rat infestation of local restaurants, and noise pollution. And this is just the point I'd like to make. It's not as significant as the other points I've made, but especially to young people, that it's an early lesson in being humble and knowing that you have to start somewhere in order to pursue your dreams. I eventually did move on from local politics and neighborhood news to covering the Iraq War in a book that I co-wrote and reported with a journalist by the name of Chris Hedges, who'd covered every major war in the previous 20 years. And this book is called Collateral Damage, America's War Against Iraqi Civilians. And it tells the story of the war through the eyes of the veterans who witnessed or participated in war crimes against civilians. The process of doing the reporting on this book was fascinating. Here's a Muslim, hijab-wearing woman interviewing nearly 50 soldiers and Marines, mostly men, who had served in the war. Most of the conversations took place over the phone, sometimes for hours, and for some of the troops, it was the only time they'd spoke about some of the heinous things they saw. They couldn't talk to their families or friends because it was just too dark. One man, when he met me in person and saw that I was Muslim, stormed off in anger and said there was no way he would talk to me. But another broke down in tears and said he always felt guilty when he spoke to Muslim journalists because of what he'd done. But these interviews allowed us to come to very important conclusions about the war. We found that the very mechanics of the occupation, the way the war was being conducted on a day-to-day basis, served as the flashpoints of violence in the war. So we looked at different areas. We looked at the raids that were taking place in Iraq, and you'd be hard-pressed to find a single Iraqi family that hadn't experienced the terror involved in a house raid, which meant soldiers dressed from head to toe in military gear, pointing weapons in their faces, separating the men from the women and children, often taking these men to detention facilities where they would disappear for months on end and their families would not know what happened to them. Of course, we know the story of what happened to many people in detention, the torture that took place, and the fact that so much radicalization happened that eventually it created groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and the rest is history, as they say. We also looked at convoys. So when the US or really any military occupy a country, they often travel in convoys, which is like a string of vehicles to travel from place to place for their own safety. But what that meant is the safety of the civilian population was compromised, because if an Iraqi vehicle would drive in between that convoy, the rules of engagement in the US military held that they could be shot and killed. So when we heard about up to 1 million Iraqis being killed in the war, we wanted to know how is this happening, and we realized that, again, the very mechanics of the occupation was what was allowing these atrocities to take place. Similarly, checkpoints, these were often set up at a moment's notice, especially at the beginning of the war. Sometimes soldiers told us it was just a few rocks that symbolized the checkpoint. And again, if a family were to drive past the checkpoint, not knowing this was a checkpoint, they could also be shot and killed. And actually the cover of the book, which is quite graphic, is the result of the checkpoint shooting in which an Iraqi family, the two parents were killed, and the children were in the car and sort of witnessed that incident. And finally, we looked at Hearts and Minds, which is, it refers to the racism inherent in the military that kind of allows these atrocities to take place. So for us Muslims, the word hajj, when somebody goes to Hajj, is a venerated term. In the military, Haji was a racial epithet used to describe Iraqis in a really derogatory way, similar to the way the word gook was used in the Vietnam War. So this was really a chance to uncover a story that I think had largely been ignored in the context of reporting on this war. It just wasn't part of the conversation. And even when our reporting came out, it was virtually blacked out by the US media. They had no interest in reporting on the atrocities committed in the war. The people who were interested were in Ireland, the UK, South Africa. Those were the people who were interested in this reporting. With the exception of some outlets like Democracy Now! In the US, which are progressive, independent outlets. But I guess it shouldn't have been a surprise that that was the reaction of the US media, given what happened during the run-up to the Iraq War. And the media's complicity in spreading the lies that helped justify the invasion of Iraq, from Saddam's supposed connection to 9/11 to the non-existent WMDs. This was a monumental failure by the media, which they were forced to apologize for years later. And it's actually interesting when you hear this whole conversation about fake news, which in this day and age is referred, it's sort of a way to dismiss the mainstream media by the right, by the Trump administration. It's important to know that for certain groups in this country who have been on the receiving end of the failure by the mainstream media, it rings true to a certain degree that sometimes fake news refers to the media adopting state propaganda, basically spouting it without any kind of critical eye to it. But it's not just the false stories that made it in. It was the narratives that were completely excluded. So I recently met a lawyer based in Washington, D.C. who had decades of experience in government. He was actually part of the Church Committee in the 1970s that investigated the intelligence agencies. And he told me something interesting. He said in the run-up to the Iraq War, he worked with over 100 city councils to pass resolutions condemning the war, saying we should not go to war. And this is a very well-connected man. Despite his best efforts, he told me he could not get that story told in any US newspaper. And he actually likened the role of journalists in galvanizing support for the Iraq War to William Hearst during the Spanish-American War, talking about yellow journalism. As we saw during the run-up to the Iraq War itself, during times of conflict, the battle to control the flow of information becomes intense, and there's little room for dissent. But that was then, and as I mentioned in the beginning, there's reason to be hopeful now. That's because the media landscape is larger and more diverse than ever. And social media makes these outlets and voices more accessible than ever. Shortly after my book with Chris Hedges came out, I joined Al Jazeera English, a channel that had been around for less than 2 years. Its sister channel, Al Jazeera Arabic, had launched in Doha, Qatar in 1996 and completely transformed the Middle East. When it began, it was the only independent or non-state-owned channel in the Arab world, and was broadcasting stories, opinions, and dissenting views that were previously virtually unheard of in the region. And it was seen as a breath of fresh air for a population that had to rely mostly on propaganda outlets for news. This was before the internet, so access to information and independent outlets was extremely limited. Its coverage during the Iraq War also filled an information gap. So as the channel's reporters like to put it, while the world media is there when the missiles are launched, we're there. We go to places where they land and speak to the victims. 10 years after Al Jazeera Arabi came on the scene, the network launched an English language channel which broke ground as a 24-hour international news channel that finally represented the global South, as opposed to Western perspectives. It has one of the most diverse, if not the most diverse, newsrooms in the world, and when the channel launched, it actually had a model where it was following the sun, so starting the day in Kuala Lumpur, going to Doha, Qatar, then London, then Washington, D.C. to represent perspectives around the world. And it quickly gained a big following in countries that previously never saw their news on screen, places like Nigeria and Pakistan. As a journalist, you get to witness history and write its first draft. For example, a couple of months ago, I was at that epic press conference in the East Room of the White House that went on for hours with Donald Trump. Of course, he didn't call on me when I was trying to ask him about the travel ban. Imagine that hijabi doesn't get called on in the White House. But that excitement aside, what I think was exciting, was great about this job was its mission. Being a voice for the voiceless, amplifying perspectives and views that were invisible for too long on English language outlets, and challenging power. Similarly to the effect that Al Jazeera Arabic had in the Middle East, AJE offered perspectives that were often buried or totally unrepresented by other English language outlets. Just to give you an example, not long after Barack Obama's inauguration in 2009, we broke a story that few outlets would have told. A Guantanamo Bay detainee called one of our reporters, Samir Haj, himself a former detainee, who was unjustly imprisoned by the Bush administration for doing his job, and told him that after Obama came into office, the conditions had actually gotten worse, and that he'd been attacked in his cell by a SWAT team more than once. We were also the only international channel in Gaza when Israel attacked it in late 2008-2009. The coverage of our reporters there, Ayman Mohyeddin and Shireen Tadros, was watched around the world, including in the State Department. This was also the case during the Arab Spring a few years later, when AJE was already on the ground in several countries like Egypt and Tunisia, was well placed to cover the events with nuance and understanding of the local context, unlike many other outlets which just parachuted in to cover the historic events. A study conducted by communications graduate students found that Al Jazeera English functions as what they call conciliatory media, which is media that is more likely to cover contentious issues in a way that contributes to creating an environment that's more conducive to cooperation, negotiation, and reconciliation. Imagine this, the study also showed that the longer viewers watched the channel, the less dogmatic they became in their thinking. And imagine how that stacks up to the cable news that we see every day, where people are just shouting at each other and watching news to just reinforce their own perspectives. As a journalist, you're competing against so many forces: apathy, distraction, other news sources, social media, and now a much bigger question of what truth even is. And right now, the most valuable currency is people's attention. How do you get it? Often, I find the most effective way is to tell compelling personal stories that help explain a larger story or phenomenon, and to focus on issues or angles that are undercovered or just lost in the news cycle. To that end, I wanted to take a little bit of time to play clips from 3 different documentaries I worked on, just to show examples of what I try to achieve in my work, and how my focus on social justice, which to me is derived and inspired from my faith, figures into this work. So the first clip is a story that I think we can all relate to, because at its core, it's about the clothes we wear every single day. It's about how they're manufactured and how companies and corporations operate in a country like Bangladesh. So this is a documentary called Made in Bangladesh, which is the one, sorry, I'm not sure the actual number. Sorry, it's just going to take a minute
savings, holding our customers to everyday low prices. Welcome, Hugh Jackman!
Total revenue, I believe, every year $400 billion.
Having low prices drives traffic to our stores and increases sales.
Please welcome John Legend. Thank you.
Which then allows us to lower expenses and lower prices again.
Please welcome Tom Cruise.
All around the globe, Walmart is taking the lead and making a difference. It's a continuous loop.
The American dream has become a global concept. I think it's our country's best export.
...2012 was a good year for Walmart. But it was a bad year for Bangladesh. It experienced the deadliest factory fire in its history. Walmart shorts were among the clothes found in the charred remains. But the company escaped accountability. And for many Western retailers whose clothes are made in Bangladesh, it's business as usual. Thoughtlines travels there to investigate why.
Anybody out there know how many zeros are in $500 billion? Take it from the numbers guy. I know a lot.
The fire at the Tazreen Fashions factory last November started on the ground floor and quickly spread. At least 112 people died. Hundreds of others were injured. Many workers were trapped inside because the doors were locked and the building had no fire exits. The remains of the fire are still everywhere here. This is where workers jumped out of the burning building onto the roof of this dormitory. There's bars in all the windows, so workers had to kick out of the exhaust fans and jump onto this building. Rukia Begum's daughter, Hina, died in the fire. You haven't received any compensation for your daughter's death?
So I'm just gonna play, so I don't take up all your time, I'm just gonna play a couple of more clips and then conclude and then hand it over and then we can do Q&A because I think oftentimes the Q&A is much more interesting than whatever we have prepared. Just a couple of more.
It wasn't hard to find others. What do you make? How many buttons do you put on every day? How old are you? How long have you been working here? Celine, how old are you? Celine, do you go to school? How much money do you make in school? 2,500 taka is just $32 a month. So you're putting the...
So I wanted to show the second clip from the same documentary made in Bangladesh because it's actually an investigation into the conditions that workers in Bangladesh have to face. We actually found during this investigation that workers as young as 12 were working on clothing for Gap, which as a company that really tries to pride itself on good conditions, on a good reputation, and it was quite shocking, but also in the context of the way that these companies operate to basically maximize profits and to shield themselves from any kind of impunity, ultimately not very surprising. The second clip, the second documentary I wanted to highlight is actually one about the rise of Donald Trump. So months before the election, we went deep into Trump country to find out why he was getting so much support. Well, I was concerned about what people would say about Muslims, but still approach this with an open mind. And the clip I'm going to play is the story of a family in Logan, West Virginia, which is one of the states that had the highest turnout for Donald Trump.
In many ways,
Donald Trump is monitoring that.
Tape will come out soon.
in many ways, the Atkins are a typical family in Logan County. Kevin's mother and uncles worked in the coal mines. He's been a miner since he was 18. His wife Selma also comes from a coal mining family. A few months ago, Kevin's hours at work were reduced, and before that, his pay was cut. Every day, he lives in fear of being laid off again.
How many times have you been laid off? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, about 6 times
Wow.
since 2008.
Is that just because so many of the mines are closing down?
Yeah. It was right before Christmas. It was December 15th, I believe it was. I got laid off. That's a hard hit. What's that like? It's tough.
Why was that one particularly tough?
It ain't that one's all of them.
Is it because you want to support your family and it's so hard, or what's?
Yeah, I mean, it's a government. It's heartbreaking. Depressing.
So do you and your wife, do you have to have a plan B? Kind of what happens?
We just take it day to day. Really. She jokes around all the time. Says, "Well, Mom, pay that for being homeless."
How close to the truth is that?
Not even far off.
Do you need a translation? You're all from Texas. I assume if there's any group of Muslims who can translate. It's Texas. I guess it's surprising to see, sort of a Muslim journalist take this really sympathetic approach to a Trump supporter, but, months and months and months before it was sort of the vogue thing in the media to actually look at the real economic issues that were facing sort of a large swath of people in this country, we actually went out there and we spoke to these people, and it's, I think, a really unique piece of journalism for that time. But we also did highlight the racism and the xenophobia that was involved in the campaign. The last clip I wanted to show is from the documentary called The Ban, which is, we basically, very quickly into Trump's presidency, we all know the story that he issued the executive order around the travel ban, and a few days later we were on a flight to Istanbul, Turkey, to interview a Syrian family who had been affected because they were supposed to come to the US and then found out they couldn't. And this is a very short clip of their story.
The Syrian man, Abdul...
Oh, sorry, fiddlesticks. Ouch. No, it must be the connection. It's just, sorry. Thank you all for your patience and sorry for this. I actually took the time to prepare all these for you all so this wouldn't happen.
The Syrian man, Abdul Ghani, said he'd been cleared to come to the US with his family on February 1st, but they're now unable to. He met us outside of a hospital where his 2 sons were being treated for a rare genetic disorder. What does he have on his skin?
أنا هون المرضى بيقولوا لي نقص مناعة ويجرسوني بالدم ويجرسوني بالجلد